Okay, I can see that people are still coming in. We'll just give them a minute or so and then we'll get started. Okay, I think I'll just go ahead and get started. And for those that are still coming in, they can jump in when they're ready. So hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Anna Provin. I'm a project manager at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. For those who don't know us, we are a research advocacy and consulting organization working to bring intersectional feminist perspectives to foreign policy. So since November last year, we have been hosting a whole range of working meetings, events, webinars as part of our summit season, which is a whole calendar of events leading up to the first ever Feminist Foreign Policy Summit, due to take place now in less than 2 weeks on the 13th of April, 2022. So I'll say a little bit about the summit just so that we can put today's event in context, and then I'll pass over for today's important discussion. So the summit will be realized in partnership with a number of governments, Sweden, Canada, Mexico, but also the Open Society Foundations and over 15 leading civil society organizations. And the idea is to bring together the leading thinkers and practitioners in the field of feminist foreign policy for an exchange of ideas, best practices, expertise, but also to take a stand against global inequality and exclusion and militarized policymaking. We'll have a full day of sessions covering everything from demilitarization and disarmament to understanding and countering transnational anti-gender campaigns to climate justice and much more actually that I'm probably forgetting now. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, on-site participation will be extremely limited on the day, but there is an option to join virtually, so I'll make sure to post the link to register in the chat in just a second. But in any case, all of the information about our summit, the upcoming site events that we still have, and information on how to join can be found on our website. So a very short word of welcome from me, but I don't want to take too much time from the discussion. So I'll pass over to Julia now for our event.
Thank you, Anna, for the warm welcome. Welcome also from my side. I'm Julia. I'm one of the founders of SUPERRR Lab. We're a feminist organization working on inclusive and just digital futures. And just about 2 months ago, we had finished the work on the feminist tech principles. And we had this idea to host a session for the Feminist Foreign Policy Summit. And I was really happy that Nakeema and Alexandra immediately agreed to join. So thank you and welcome to the two of you, and also welcome to everyone else who's joining us. We'll be kicking off with a 40-minute discussion, and then we have time to take questions from the audience. Feel free to use the Q&A function. Elisa, who's supporting in the background, will be collecting the questions. And let me start by introducing Nakeema and Alexandra to you. Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer is a Brooklyn-born tech expert, a business angel investor, and an advocate for ethical AI technology. Nakeema founded the nonprofit organization FrauenLoop and is the CEO of TechInColor.eu, a network of racially diverse tech professionals in Europe. And as a software executive in the US and in Germany, she has led digital transformation projects. She writes and speaks about the impact of digital technologies and AI, artificial intelligence, on marginalized groups, and among many other things has given keynotes at EU parliamentary hearings. Thanks for joining us, Nakeema. Hi. And the parliamentary hearings in the EU Parliament bring us to Alexandra Geese. She's a member of the European Parliament with the Greens. She's been elected in 2019 and now serves as a member of the Committees for Internal Market and Consumer Protection, as well as the Budget Committee. And her political focus is on digital policy, fundamental rights, as well as gender budgeting. In 2020, she became part of the Special Committee on AI, on artificial intelligence in a digital age. And since 2021, she has been the Greens shadow rapporteur on the Digital Services Act. Alexandra is one of the most high-profile digital policy experts in the European Parliament. Thanks for joining us, Alexandra. I'm super happy that you're here. And the two of them together, Nakeema and Alexandra, have launched an initiative, I believe it was last year, correct me if I'm wrong, called the EU Women's Digital Manifesto together. So feminist practice and values are deeply ingrained in their practice and work, and we'll come back to the manifesto at a later point of this panel. So the title of today's event is Towards a Feminist Tech Policy. That may sound a bit dry and like, what do we mean with tech policy? But we'll discuss that in the questions, and also not only elaborate what could such a feminist tech policy look like, but also talk about how are policies being made and who's part of it and who's not. An hour will certainly not be enough to conclusively clarify what a feminist tech policy could look like, to set some expectation management, and many discussions with different perspectives will hopefully follow. And that said, this is also not the first discussion. We build on the knowledge and the expertise of generations of feminists before us, thinkers and practitioners as well. I'm sure there's also many experts in the audience. Please ask your questions in the Q&A. And I'd love to now kick this discussion off by asking you a question, Nakeema and Alexandra, that will help us to get the two of you, that will help us to get to know the two of you a little bit better. We see a lot of dystopian narratives at this infamous intersection between society and digital technology. And I'm curious, what was a positive vision that brought you to the topics, to this topic, perhaps even a feminist one? Nakeema, do you wanna give us some insights on what brought you to the topic?
Sure. I think there are different things when you talk about the dystopian visions that we're constantly kind of hearing about, reading about, and the positive visions, or the alternatives, because very often there's a lot of dystopian and there's not so much positive ideation that's happening. Luckily, one of the really exciting initiatives that I'm part of within the European digital rights space has gone through a bit of a decolonizing activity. That's something I'll talk about in more detail later, perhaps. And one of the ideation activities that we did was envisioning what would all of our work look like in 10 years, in 20 years, if we are successful in pushing a more feminist and a more sustainable and a more humanistic and a more community-focused view of technology in the future. And just to take some of the key points from that discussion away, there were 4 accomplishments that we would be celebrating in the event that things were different and the kinds of policies around technology were being created, co-created by a broader range of people. And they were as follows. The first change would be we would have decolonial digital curricula in schools. The second, so it wouldn't be a privileged information to understand the issue of digital rights and privacy that only a few would have. It would be widely supported. Surveillance tech would be defunded broadly, and those funds would be shifted to community care. Citizens would be able to celebrate 10 years, 20 years, however many years of carbon reparations, with the funds and the compensation for those reparations going to the communities that are hardest hit by climate change. And finally, most interestingly, because it names names and is not just generally speaking about a utopia, companies that are multi-pronged international marketplaces with distribution networks that are the envy of the world, in other words, Amazon, would be unionized, and workers would turn those logistical networks to the purpose of ending world hunger.
Wow, there's so much in this already. So I hope we have the time to dig a little deeper and dive into some of these visions. Alexandra, what about you? What are your visions, and what was the vision that got you enter this field, that made you enter this field?
Yeah, well, what can I say after Nakeema? I mean, that was so perfect. I start maybe with just a simpler idea. I grew up in a time where, in order to learn English, you could go to school, and then you could listen to the radio at medium waves, which is something nobody probably listened to this remembers even exists, but the quality was horrible. And otherwise, to hear native speakers speaking English in order to learn the language, there was just no way to do that. If you lived in a lower working class family and you couldn't travel, there was no other possibility. And then I saw my kids learning English basically by themselves in the internet, with music, with culture, with movies, with series, and so on. So what is really incredible, I mean, the internet is such a place that gives access to knowledge to everybody who has the instruments to seek and use that knowledge. It's technology that connects us, that allows us to communicate, that allows us to share in multiple ways. And this is what we are seeing today and through 2 years of pandemic, that while we all miss human contact, but we did stay in touch, and we managed to create, even during the past 2 years, networks and work and do really interesting things globally, internationally, on a European level. So all this sharing and communicating is traditionally very female virtue. I mean, it's the women who get together, who talk, who come up with ideas. It's a very female kind of thing, actually. And that's why I think when I then dived a little bit deeper, I don't have an IT background. When I started diving deeper into it, and I saw, well, tech actually is a very dystopian thing, especially for women and for people of color, who risks to ruin years, decades, centuries of fight for more equality, for more freedom. I said, well, I mean, it's our chance now to shape it, and we have to take in our hands. And that's why I basically jumped into it, because I think the technology itself is absolutely not the problem. The technology offers great instrument to communicate and to share, which are very feminist ideas, because those communicating, sharing knowledge, sharing a life, that's the instruments we need to build consensus, to have a lively democracy and debate. So I think the technology is absolutely great. It's just been hijacked by a very, very problematic business model. And so what I started out was to work on tech in order to build a better vision and to challenge those notions we have today of progress, of disruption, of efficiency. I think we should question that and put other values, more feminist values, more sustainable values, in their place, and optimize technology in order to fulfill those values.
Thank you. Yeah, both of you have hinted at the fact that there is a lot of opportunities and a lot of visions and a lot of positive things that can be the outcome. But we also see that digital technology has become a driving force of inequality. And there's many books, there's a lot of research that highlights this. The problem is, so to say, well known and well described. We know how technologies, how they reinforce system inequalities within our societies across the globe. So it's not only the technology that leads to injustice, but it's this already existing systemic inequalities that are amplified through this technology. And the big question is, how can we change this status quo? How can we move the needle towards more equitable and just digital futures? And Nakeema, you mentioned it as one of the first bullets, one of the first visions, the decolonializing approach, decolonializing digital rights, decolonializing tech. You wrote a article for the Gunda Werner Institute that I highly recommend. Maybe we can also put the link in the chat, where you talk about the fact that we need to decolonialize the concept of a digital world, of the digital world as it exists today. Do you want to briefly elaborate for us what you mean when you say decolonializing the digital or decolonializing tech?
Sure. So what I'll start with, because there's so much wrapped up in the decolonial idea and also the idea of technology as this frontier of opportunity that's mixed up with a lot of money, is that there's a great quote by Yeshnabit Milner, who's the founder of Data for Black Lives, where she says, you know, the world that we're living in physically today has the dynamic of money being power and power being hoarded. And that hoarding of power tends to drive policies that are reinforcing of the status quo. So if you have a real world where inequality and imbalance of power is a significant issue, it can be very attractive to retreat into this, you know, futuristic online world, digital world, where the dynamic is expected to be different, and in some way the freedoms and some of the opportunities to express oneself, to connect with others, is not supposed to adhere to what we see in the regular world. What, you know, the past decades of exposure to digital life has taught us as women, as people of color, as people with different, you know, degrees of legal residence in the places where we live, as differently abled people, as people who are, for one reason or another, not as likely to see themselves reflected in these digital spaces and the digital tools that have become the baseline for engaging with others online, is that we're seeing that there's not this diversity of the real world as represented. What we're seeing is that there's a centering of certain communities, certain identities, certain regions geographically, and decolonizing those representations in the digital world really means making room and making space for different experiences to have centrality, different languages to have centrality, and different individuals to have the freedom to navigate without fear of offline power dynamics kind of subsuming their online expressed desires and engagements.
Thanks. And Alexandra, you're working on many, or you're part of many of these policy discussions, policy processes. When you hear Nakeema speak about like room and space for individuals who are not already like in a place of power where they can influence these debates, do you see room and space for people joining these policy debates? Is decolonializing or decoloniality approaches, are these approaches something that policymakers talk about, that have room in policy discussions?
Unfortunately, no. To be very honest, in Brussels, I'm not seeing this. I mean, in Brussels, it's still not uncommon to see manuals. You know, I was asked to moderate a panel on cloud technology, very high-ranking, high-level panel. And I realized at 8, the panel was like at 1, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, I realized there were only men on that panel. So I called in and said, well, you know, I'm not moderating that panel if I'm the only woman and I'm only moderating, no way. And it was like, oh, we can't change that right now. And you should have thought of that. It was just, I just didn't expect it. So that's the level where we still are, actually. So extremely far away from any kind of diversity and inclusiveness, not to speak of decolonization. So I think Nakeema has still a lot of work, and we all have a lot of work to do. What is interesting is, how do you operationalize this? I mean, as a lawmaker, it's difficult to force companies. What we are trying to do in the Digital Services Act, with this new European legislation coming up to regulate digital platforms, and which will probably have a global influence, because also lawmakers from the US are very, very closely looking at us, is try to figure out, what does a safe online space mean for all people? Because so far we always hear from the traditional digital rights community, well, we need freedom of expression, and freedom of expression is often intended as being able to say anything you want online, as long as it's not clearly illegal. And that creates, together with the algorithmic systems and the business model of the big platforms, which push content that creates hate, that creates anger and fear, creates an online environment that gets very dangerous for minority, for women, who are particularly targeted by hate speech. And therefore, we are trying to find a very delicate balance between freedom of expression being intended as being able to say what you want without being censored in the internet, and at the same time creating a safe space for people who are more likely to be attacked on the internet than others. And that's really, I think, a redefinition of freedom of expression, because of 50% of women and 50% of young people, and I imagine among people of color, the percentage is a lot higher. I haven't seen even any numbers. This is so far behind us, as far behind as we are in Europe. Say they don't dare to express their opinion freely in the internet because they're afraid of hate speech. We don't have freedom of expression for the majority of the population right now. And I think we need to redefine that concept. And that's really complicated. And this is what we are sort of, you know, on the one hand, trying to get a shift of paradigm on a more philosophical and conceptual level, saying, well, digital rights also means, and freedom of expression also means that you are safe in the internet. But when you have to operationalize it in the legislation, obviously it gets complicated. And this is what we are trying to do. And it's a very delicate balance.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we all know about the power imbalances between civil society organizations and then well-paid lobbyists. I think it was 100 million that big tech is spending on lobbying in Brussels. So what is a way, like, how do you include civil society organizations? What are like mechanisms that can help in order to balance out this imbalance that is created by money? Are there any mechanisms in place, or this question is to you, Alexandra, is there something, or how would you approach this? How is the European Commission Parliament approaching this power imbalance?
Yeah, it depends on how you want to look at it. It's obviously difficult. What we do have is a transparency register. So all lobbying organizations need to register with the European Parliament. So if you receive them as a member of the European Parliament, you ask for the lobbying number, and so there's a footprint basically. The heads of committee chairs and the rapporteurs, who are the people who are really in charge of that legislation, without going too much into detail of European legislation, have to show the legislative footprint. So they have to show who they have met with when they were working on that legislation. Normal members of the committee don't have to, so I don't have an obligation to do that in my case. What I do is I try to, we get enormous amounts of requests for meetings from lobbying organizations, mostly industry. So we try to have like 50-50 balance, at least, between industry and civil society organizations, which is not always easy. And it means that we proactively ask organizations to come and see us, because they obviously have a lot less women power and don't have the time to go and see every MEP and set up meetings. So we try to get a 50-50 balance. We don't always manage, but this is something that politicians, for example, could do. Mm-hmm. I think we need to talk about it more. We have the problem really in Brussels that the lobbying is very subtle. It's not only official, Google or Facebook or whoever lobbyists coming to see you, but it's this multitude and universal sort of consulting firms where you don't really know who they're representing. All the think tanks in Brussels who do very interesting events, always attended by people from the Commission, by members of the European Parliament. All of them are funded or by Google or by Facebook or by Amazon or a combination of the above. Many universities do take Google, Facebook, and so on money. So it's very difficult to find independent researchers who are really, really independent. I think there we need more regulation in order to make sure that we have independent research. We need more public funding. So it's a more general societal issue to make sure we have public institutions that are well functioning and have a maximum amount of transparency.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this before, Nakeema, that the whole kind of tech policy discourse is very academic, very kind of expert-driven. So what is something you wish people knew about tech policy and how it is being made?
I wish that they knew what Alexandra just said about how much money, industry money, is often behind the decisions that policymakers need to make about new technologies that may be very poorly understood or very unfamiliar to the policymakers. And I think what it would be helpful for regular civilians to understand about the policymaking process is that, what gets counted counts. So if you are in the rooms and if you are attending the information sessions and if you are talking about these technologies as the future, then that is very likely to be how they are understood by policymakers. It takes a lot of effort, and it usually is grassroots community types of effort that can counterbalance those narratives with the lived experiences of people who have had what are called edge cases or outlier experiences. But really, we're talking about how do we get the policymakers to understand the risks and the social impacts of different types of technologies used in different ways. To take that even further, I think there is a window of opportunity. It's not just a matter of, the people versus big tech money. I think there's an increasing interest in the policy world in looking at ESG impact and measuring impact, not just of environmental, but now increasingly of social and governance. So the S and the G that no one ever talks about. There's more and more openness to having a sense of how can we measure the social impact of certain technologies applied in different ways, especially when we talk about taking a feminist approach to that. What I see as a feminist approach to tech policy and those challenges, those traditional challenges, is looking at areas other than financial impact for shareholders and looking at more global impact, like the social impact for community members and for people who are not part of those policy discussions.
Yeah.
Can I come back in there?
Yeah, sure.
Because I just had two ideas when Nakeema was speaking. First of all, I wanted a little bit to dispel the idea that I might have given before that tech, big tech, the industry controls everything here in Brussels. Because what is interesting to see right now, that in spite of this big spending and this very well done policy and very professional people, they are losing their big battle right now, because we are finalizing the Digital Services Act, and we are probably getting what we wanted and what they strongly lobbied against, which is at least a partial ban on the use of personal data for targeting people with advertising. And this is exactly what they have been lobbying against for 2 years. And we don't get the total ban, but we are coming pretty close and taking really big steps here. So there is hope, if you have good arguments and good networks, it's always possible to go against them. So we shouldn't just, give in and say, well, there's nothing we can do, because we are proving that there's a lot you can do. A different suggestion, we are working now also on the Artificial Intelligence Act, which will be absolutely crucial, because artificial intelligence is really one of those technologies that always support existing power structures and enhance existing power structures, as you both have explained. And there we are coming up with the idea that we need to include the most affected population groups in the development of the tools in all stages. The problem is we are not really ready to operationalize this. So what exactly does a company need to do? How to involve a community and affected group, and how to make sure, second question, that I don't know, NGO representation of particularly affected group isn't forced to basically work without being paid, giving knowledge and expertise to that company that the company should, give for itself, and that should be part of the development cost. So having some, it's an idea also for civil society organizations coming up with some guidance how we could operationalize this. This would really be helpful in this stage, because we now have the legislation, the proposal on the table, but it's difficult to operationalize this idea that would make sure that people, especially the most affected communities, get involved from the beginning, because I think that would be one of the game changers, and we could implement that now if we had ideas that would, withhold legal scrutiny.
Certainly an interesting idea, but then also someone I wonder, it sounds great in theory, but how would it work in reality when people are hustling 40-hour weeks in order to afford their rent in Berlin or other European cities? So I don't know, Nakeema, if you want to chime in here, if you have some thoughts on that, if this is completely far out there to include these groups in, or if the theory and the reality are if there's a disconnect, if you see a disconnect there.
I don't. I actually am really encouraged by the mention of not just consciously including underrepresented groups in the decision-making, policy decision-making process, but also the recognition of the labor that is often unpaid, that these activists and grassroots organizers often are obliged or feel obliged to provide without compensation. I think there is a happy medium, and in the same way or similar way to how we sometimes use more enlightened product design strategies within the tech world, and we don't just map out when rolling out a new product or service, the happy path of how things will go if everything works, but we map out the unhappy paths and the challenges and obstacles to accessing the product or service in the ways that we intend. I think that's a really good model for how to maybe approach this process of rolling out AI and different artificial intelligence implementations in real world scenarios, legal law enforcement, immigration, this type of thing, whereby you have to include as a condition, perhaps, of presenting a fully tested system for public use, you have to include edge cases, which are paid, compensated feedback from community members who typically, or based on the tests that you run, have least favorable or less favorable outcomes, and at least an acknowledgement of the fact that there may be, and in many cases there's likely to be, some communities that are, or individuals that are negatively impacted by the ways that this technology is rolled out, and that you have made, as the producer, as the person who's trying to scale this technology, you've made some effort to quantify and to create transparency as to what those negative outcomes may be, before you have to deal with the reality of lawsuits and wholesale problems after the fact.
I think it's very interesting to talk about how can principles be put into practice. Earlier this year, as I mentioned, we worked on 12 feminist tech principles, very much inspired by the feminist foreign policy that is now part of the German coalition agreement that governments around the world have picked up. So I am very hopeful that things will change and these new concepts will be adopted and adapted. So if we look at the feminist tech policy and what it could look like, or what it takes to implement it, if we start with the values, like what are values, Nakeema, that have to be at the core of such a feminist tech policy, of a new approach towards policy making in the field of tech development and tech regulation?
Three things come to mind off the top of my head. The first and the most important is sustainability. What is the effect on the planet that we all live on? The second is humanity, in terms of what effects large scale, long term on humans and their behavior will a particular type of technology have. And finally, community, in the sense of what effect does the technology have on others with whom you may or may not have regular interactions, or you may never have interactions, but nonetheless who belong to the human community and someone's community somewhere. So those three things, I think, are very strong. They're not as all-encompassing as the 12 policies on the SUPERRR website, but they are, for me, the most critical and the most lacking in terms of very capitalistic tech policy that we've seen in the past.
Thanks. What would you add to that, Alexandra, to that values that Nakeema just mentioned?
Well, completely sharing the values Nakeema mentioned. I think equal accessibility, equal representation, I think is important, because it's not only about decisions being taken that, promote sustainability and community, but about everybody being able to equally participate in that decision-making. And if I can come back to a more operational level, that means being present, being represented in the places where those decisions are taken, be that in business, be that in politics, especially in tech companies, but also in political forums. But it also means that the funds have to be distributed equally and in a just way, which is one really of the big issues when you try to operationalize this. You see that the money goes to that privileged group, even public money that is being distributed. And Nakeema and I worked a lot on this last year. So if we want to achieve that equal representation, and we know that if women are more present in decision-making, decisions will be more socially and ecologically and economically sustainable. There's a lot of research about this. that, for example, companies take more sustainable decisions, reduce their CO2 emissions quickly. Women as political leaders are usually take decisions that benefit more the community as a whole, and equality in that country. And that's really interesting. So that goes all in the same direction. But we also have to make sure that the money is distributed with the idea or the criteria of an equal representation, because this today is absolutely not the case. Neither private money, nor private funds, nor public funds, and especially in the tech sector. The tech sector is one of the worst, absolutely, here.
And in the 12 principles, just to come back to the 12 principles that we worked at, the values that both of you described are part of some of the principles, right? The first one, like we go from a very global perspective to like an interpersonal perspective. So the global one entails sustainability and how sustainability is linked to social equality. And then on a more individual level, we look at privacy, we look at identity, at consent, at informed consent. And Nakeema, you've contributed a principle around privacy. So the title is Privacy by Default, Not Surveillance by Default. And Alexandra mentioned that there are new legislations around advertisements in the making and up and coming. So can you tell us a little bit about the principles, the principle that you wrote, and why you decided for the privacy by default and not surveillance principle?
So to summarize it very simply, when I got interested in technology, which I didn't mention when I started at the beginning of this talk, I was interested in technology as this absolutely open new frontier where everyone was learning on the job, on their way, as they played games or as they reached out to others who were in the cyber space to chat, to share files. It was very much, the heyday of Web 1.0, and everything was possible or felt that way. Fast forward to today, where I'm looking at my initial idea of the internet as this exciting frontier where anyone can reinvent themselves as anything that they want, using the same tools and being pretty much equal to everyone else on the web, versus today where, not to sort of reference Dark Mirror too much, but you have what's essentially this booby-trapped environment where every unique and quirky and identifiable aspect of every individual is being boiled down or simplified down to what we call in the industry personas. And these personas, which are basically decontextualized, superficial representations of who we are being used to monetize whatever advertisers want to sell. So, in terms of how we see ourselves and what we want to project about ourselves in the real world as women, or as immigrants, or as teachers, tech executives, policymakers, whatever, having that be boiled down to the child of divorced parents who might be susceptible to certain kinds of purchases. So let's flood their feed with all kinds of advertisements because of certain activities that they've performed online, certain content that they've read that leads us to believe that, maybe this is a sexual assault victim. So maybe we could push this kind of purchase or, consumable, or maybe this person is expecting a child. These are the kinds of environments that we're now talking about. Same open, open for exploration internet are now places where very few people seem to be aware that we are being stalked, we are being surveilled, and our data, which often goes to third parties, data brokers that no one can even name, it's being bought and sold on the basis of personas that represent what we might want to buy or what we might be sold or pushed into clicking on in outrage or engaging in out of manipulation. So privacy by default, when I wrote this feminist tech principle, was about combating that and creating some degree of baseline privacy by default, because whether or not those who are surfing the web without defensive browsers and VPNs and all of the tools and bells and whistles to hide all of their data and mask it from potential interlopers, everyone should have the ability to visit sites, content, engage in conversation without the fear of having their data scraped, their identities sold, and their experiences minimized and taken out of context for the purposes of monetization. So that's really what I was getting at with this idea of privacy by default, because we're not there yet. And I think the legislation that Alexandra is working on is moving towards creating a real informed consent environment where we're not falling into these pitfalls of our data being scraped without our knowledge. We know that the internet becomes a place where we can't be as easily manipulated based on what content we've read or what purchases we've made.
Yeah, and it's good to hear from Alexandra that some of these pieces are already underway, like some of these regulations and policies. And looking at those pieces that are underway and how they came into being, I'm wondering if we develop a feminist tech policy framework with a set of civil society organizations, but also individuals, how would such a framework be best of use for the work that you are doing, Alexandra, for the work of policymakers? How can we bring it from like theory into practice and get it into the policymaking processes?
That's a great question, and I think I've been trying to answer that throughout the event, because that's my political brain that always. I think this is the game Nakeema and I have been playing, that she comes up with the vision and the principle, and I try to operationalize it. I think trying to figure out how to really translate that into legislation at the European or national level, but on, in terms of tech policy right now, especially if you talk platforms, you talk artificial intelligence, so we're the big pieces, that's Europe basically. Trying to figure out how it can fit into different pieces of legislation. And that's why I asked that question before. If we want to have a more participatory approach and getting affected communities into the decision making, we have to figure out how to put that into the Artificial Intelligence Act, because that's going to be the framework legislation which will decide how tools will be developed and scrutinized and authorized on the market. So really trying to figure out for each piece of legislation, where could we fit that principle in, and how could we translate it into the real world? But then, the political level is extremely important, but we also need this cultural shift of paradigm. And I think this is what you've been working on really, really, really well, as well as Nakeema. It's often to see, it's difficult often to see the big picture. How I think, and another point is important to explain, to have the story, to explain with concrete examples how that works, because technology is extremely intransparent. I mean, not the technology, but how we are, the business model that is controlling it today, what Nakeema explained. Most people don't know. And therefore, it's difficult to explain why the work you're doing at political level is so relevant, because it's so intransparent and it's very abstract. When people ask me, so what are you doing in the Digital Services Act? So, or I have 10 minutes time, and people still are lost when I'm done. Or it's very difficult. Journalists ask you the question, so, how does my life change starting from tomorrow when this enters into force? And I'm like, going to take some time, sorry. because the rules are very abstract. So try to tell the stories, you know, how does this really affect my life? What is changing in my life because the technology works one way or another, and how could it work if we implemented that principle? So on the one hand, you know, trying to figure out how to put this into legislation in a practical way. And on the other hand, tell the story. How could my life, how could people's life, women's lives, people of color's life be better if this worked differently?
Mm-hmm.
If I can
If
if I can just add on to that, I would say that it's really important maybe to keep in mind that instead of trying to convince people of the potential for harm in certain areas or communities, maybe part of that process should be working backwards from the harms, right? And working backwards from the anticipated harmful impacts to, you know, collect input from members of the groups, communities, areas where this harmful impact is most likely to occur, and then work backwards from a policy perspective so that this can either be avoided entirely, this risk of harmful impact, or there can be some built-in component of input and assessment that's coming from these likely to be impacted groups.
Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe, so many more. Yeah.
If I may, just one more element. On a European level, it's very important to be present in very early stages of legislation. Like the European Commission always does a consultation. And who participates in the consultation? The industry, because they know this is going to happen. And they have, you know, the women or manpower in that case very often to submit papers, to fill in the forms, and just to have, you know, to know how that process works and to have positions that are operationalized enough to go into a political process, say, this is important, this is important, this is important, and to coordinate among civil society organizations, and maybe to send your message, to push your message with bigger civil society organizations like, I don't know, trade unions, churches, you know, people who have the capacity to jump into that process and to weigh in, to pass that message, participate in those processes. I think that's something very practical, but that's very important, because actually the Commission does take that into account if you come in a very early phase.
Mm-hmm. And if you have the resources to do so, but this is something you touched upon earlier as well. I want to jump to some questions from the audience for the last 10 minutes. Sarah Wild had a question about impact assessment. So she says, I'm familiar with doing data protection impact assessments. Do groups also do something like equitability impact assessments? Alexandra, Nakeema, are you familiar with equitability, or have you heard of equitability impact assessments?
I haven't. What I've been trying to push very strongly are gender impact assessments, more specifically, more on the budget side, actually, because there you actually have a process, you have standards you can work by, and I've been doing that for the big economic stimulus program that the European Commission or the European Council has come up with in reaction to the economic crisis due to the pandemic, where a large part of the funds, 20%, goes to the digital sector. And we asked for gender impact assessments to be done on the whole package, because otherwise the money would probably go to male-dominated sectors. And this is exactly we didn't get that piece into the legislation, the gender impact assessments. I've been doing this with the Greens group on 3 countries, and we actually saw that the money is mainly going to men, and very, very little money is going to women. And the digital sector, it's even worse than in the other sectors. So gender impact assessments exist, but I think it would be an interesting idea to have a general equitability, I don't know, a GSE impact maybe assessment. I mean, those are interesting ideas and interesting instruments.
Okay, Nakeema, do you want to add to this, or should I jump to the next question?
I would agree with what Alexandra was saying, and I think it's just, I would add that it's very new. This equity impact assessments is still very much a new concept that's kind of coming from this gender impact assessment concept, but there's still some question as to, is it E, is it S, is it G? Where and how do you structure these impact assessments, and what kind of equity is it that you're measuring in which cases? So to be continued.
There's a question from Anne Goldman, who would like to talk about current technologies that challenge a feminist approach the most, or are the most kind of invasive or dangerous for a feminist approach. I'm not wanting to end on a dystopian note here, but yeah, maybe
that's maybe the wrong question. Well, I would say certainly artificial intelligence is a big, big challenge, and it's a challenge because it is the principles that underlie any type of machine learning or machine automation are historical data. Historical data means we're looking at the past at large, and we're drilling down to specific areas of impact, and we're trying to replicate the impact of past procedures and concepts that have been operationalized and project them into the future faster. So obviously that's a significant challenge, because the embedded assumptions, and in many cases the power relationships and the representation or lack thereof, is exactly what gets carried over into the projections of how the future should look, and what types of artificial intelligence projections and predictions are being operationalized going forward. So that's a definite area where espousing a feminist viewpoint is difficult, because in many cases you're fighting against a system that wants the computer-driven predictions to be absolute truth and absolutely objective. And it's a lot of transparency exercises that need to be conducted to expose the fact that most data sets that are historical are fundamentally biased and oftentimes against women, among others.
I just totally agree. It's just nothing I have to add.
Ellen Eamke is asking, on what basis could feminist tech principles be made mandatory for companies directly, and which types of regulation could do it?
I think for the regulation piece, Alexandra should take that. On what basis could they be made mandatory? Clearly, there needs to be some incentivized, financially connected guideline. That's the only way that we get companies that are most concerned about their share price and their month over month and year over year performance to care about the impact that their technologies have on the environment, and the impact that their technologies have on violence against women or any other community. These are the levers that are most likely to be the most powerful and the most effective in the short term. In terms of policy, I defer to Alexandra in terms of what she sees as possible.
Yeah, it's complicated, because, for politicians to meddle with companies' decisions, it's always not easy. Well, what we're working on here in Europe is the Women on Boards Directive. I don't think women on boards is a solution for everything, frankly, but it does help, especially if you get 50%, then it does help. The evidence shows that, but it's not the only one. Pay transparency is another regulation we're working on here right now that has come back, that should have existed for a long time, but it hasn't, and now it's come back. I think that's important too, because, women are still paid a lot worse, even in the IT sector, which generally pays well than men. So to make that transparent helps a little bit. And then where I think we can strongly step in is in the moment where companies use public funding. this is really where we should go. And I'm quite happy that in German, in the coalition agreement for the Germans among us, or for who's interested, we have a provision that says that a part of the Zukunftsfonds, which is the German public VC fund, has to go to female or mixed teams. So this is really more Nakeema's terrain, so I won't go too much into the figures, but in terms of private and public capital, especially for startups, all female teams are like what, 4-6% something, or even less, 1%, you know. The mixed teams, it's all below 10%, so it's all one figure, it's be it mixed or all female teams, so it's really crazy. And if we have public funds, I think there needs to be a 50% rule. This is what I would go into the political debate with, that it's going to be difficult, but at least have a fixed share, and whatever we put there as a quota right now will be better than what we have in reality. And you know, the European level is distributing quite a lot of money. I already mentioned the stimulus package was called the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and we could have built it in there. And the European Council chose not to. The Parliament called for it. We really worked hard for this, and we had a great Parliament position. Council kicked it out, so the member states' governments. I could mention that 24 out of 27 ministers for economic affairs who decided that are male, maybe not a coincidence. There is talk right now about a new package, which is not so much on digital, more on the energy sector, to counter the effect of the Russian, of the sanctions because of the war and so on. And we really need to make sure that every time we give public money to companies, we look at a diversity aspect, and we make sure there's a share for women, because otherwise the whole economy is going to shift towards very male-dominated sectors: energy, transport, buildings, for combating the climate crisis. This is where the money is going, the investment is going, public investment, and the digital sector, where there's a lot of private money as well, more private than public actually. But public is a role model. And if the public sector says, okay, half the women, half the taxpayers are women, and therefore we have to spend the money accordingly, I think this will sort of, have an impact on the private sector as well. And then Nakeema is more an expert on the private sector, but on regulation. This is what I'm suggesting. And what is really interesting, and what I'm sorry, I'm being too long. Yeah, we have a gender tracking obligation for the European budget, the 7-year budget of Europe. And we will have the first results coming up, I think, in a few months, to see how much of the money is going to men and women, and also in the tech sector. And I think that's going to be really, really interesting.
Thank you so much. There's so many more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. And Lisa just asks what we're leaving with, what makes us hopeful. And I hope that we touched upon some things that are making us hopeful, not only the points in the beginning that Nakeema mentioned, the visions that I'm curious to elaborate more. I hope we're going to have a follow-up discussion of this conversation to dive a little deeper into the visions. But for now, I want to say thank you for your time, Alexandra and Nakeema, for sharing your thoughts and visions and approaches with us. And yeah, I hope we get together again soon, and we'll continue this discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us and for listening to us, and for asking questions. Have a really nice evening, everyone. Take good care. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.